This video response is going to go out to this person right here, and I'm not sure this is a real person, but just in case it is, I will go ahead and present the meat and potatoes of this matter. Okay, Mr. Repzion uploaded a video. I then left a comment on that video stating that sin as a God concept has nothing to do with humanity whatsoever. And what's the response I got? Evidence or GTFO, and other than the Bible too. Okay, well, as a data processor, I present my evidence in the line of flowcharting. We'll say, well, flowcharting wasn't around back then. No, it wasn't, but the way I'm going to present my evidence is in the method of flowcharting, because that's what I'm best at as a data processor. Okay, now the first thing we have to do is validate the Bible. How do we do that? Okay, people have to remember that back in those days, long, long ago, before God actually wrote down the Ten Commandments on the pieces of stone, that stories like Abraham and Noah and that kind of thing, even Adam and Eve, were passed down by word of mouth. Okay? It wasn't until the Egyptians and the Babylonians came along that we finally had a real good writing language. All right? Up until that point, most of this was transmitted from word of mouth. In other words, somebody spoke it, and then the younger person would memorize it, word for word. And that's how these stories got passed down from one to the next. All right? Now, by the time of Moses, even the Hebrew people had a writing language, and there was a lot of people in the Hebrew language, okay, the Hebrews, the Jews, okay. There were a lot of people that did know how to read and write. And so these stories started getting written down. And then these stories were passed down, written-wise, from one generation to the next. Now, they also did it with an oral tradition. Why was that? Because a lot of times the Israelites were captured by foreigners. And the foreigners would then burn up all the manuscripts. And what's a manuscript? This is a written document, usually done on papyrus. Okay? They would take papyrus and they'd write the stuff down. Pin it down with special ink. Okay? But like I said, when a foreign army invaded Israel, they usually burned up all the documents. So in order to keep the stories alive, the older generation would force the younger generation to memorize the stuff, so that when they were no longer captured, they could write it down again. And that's how that came to be. Hence the Dead Sea Scrolls. At the time of Jesus, that's what they did. They wrote down all the stuff, Old Testament stuff, and they made a physical copy. And in this case, they hid it in what is called the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, when it comes to the book of Isaiah, if you take a look at the book of Isaiah today, and you take a look at the book of Isaiah from the Dead Sea Scroll, you'll see they're virtually identical. That means they've done an excellent job of copying from one to the next, to the next, to the next for the last 2,000 years. And probably before that. So, we can say that the book of Isaiah is pretty reliable. This is also true of the New Testament. We have portions of manuscripts that date all the way back to 125 of the Common Era. And when we look at these fragments and we compare them to what we have written today, they're virtually identical. So that means these people were copying this stuff over and over again that accurately for the last 2,000 years. That means that these are probably the most historically accurate documents you will ever see. So what you read today is virtually identical to what you would have read 2,000 years ago. And if you don't believe me, I have a link down below that will prove this. It's the first link. Okay? There'll be a second link, but the first link will show you that what you're reading today in the Bible is virtually identical to what you would have read 2,000 years ago when Jesus was alive. Now, that in itself doesn't prove much of anything. Well, you can say, well, a fairy tale written the same way for 2,000 years would still be a fairy tale. And I agree with you on that, except for one thing. Nobody back then, there is no document from antiquity that ever questioned the integrity of the Bible. They had a lot of questions, but it was not the integrity of the Bible. They actually said back then that what was written in that Bible was accurate. Because it was a sham, it was a phony, it was a piece of junk. There would have been ancient manuscripts that would have said, hey, look, don't read this thing's a piece of garbage, we can refute all this, so on and so forth. Nobody refuted what was written in there. The only thing that ever was refuted was whether Jesus was God. That was the only thing that ever was refuted. They didn't refute the fact that Jesus existed, that he did what he did. They just weren't sure if he was God or not. That was the only thing that ever was refuted. Okay? Now, I know there were some people that started questioning whether Jesus had actually risen from the dead. Okay? But, for the most part, they did not question the New Testament documents. They did not say, well, Jesus never existed, that Jesus never did any of these things. They said that. They said he did these things and he existed. So the existence of Jesus is no longer in question. He did exist, and there's my proof. Of course, if you want more proof, all you have to do is look at the Quran, the documents from the Roman Empire, and the documents from the Jewish Sanhedrin of the time. They'll tell you that Jesus existed and that he did a bunch of wonderful miracles. They just will never acknowledge his deity. Well, anyway, let's go on here. So, we've now established that Jesus existed and he did all these wonderful things. Now, to figure out his deity, all we have to do is find out whether Jesus was 100% honest 100% of the time. If Jesus was indeed 100% honest 100% of the time, then he was God, because he declared himself to be God. So it's his honesty, it's his integrity that's at stake here. Very few people ever argue that point. They're so intent on arguing that he never existed at all that they never bothered to argue, well, gee, he existed, but we don't know how honest he was. That would be a refreshing argument, to see if Jesus was really as honest as he said he was. But I think too many people are afraid of what would happen if it was suddenly proved that Jesus himself was as honest as he said he was. Because if Jesus was honest 100% of the time, there was no question about his integrity, then when Jesus says there really is a God, and he's the Son of God, then that puts a lot of these people in trouble immediately. Because you see, Jesus also said that the Old Testament was true in several statements. He said Noah's flood was true, that Moses and the Ten Commandments were true. All these wonderful stories about King David, they were all true because Jesus said so. And if Jesus is 100% honest, then therefore, it's sort of like the transitive property. If A equals B and B equals C, then A must equal C. Therefore, if Jesus said the Old Testament was true, and Jesus never lied, then the Old Testament is true. Boom. Then you have a problem. Okay, so now that we've established that Jesus was real, okay, and we've also established, if you want to argue with me on this point, you go right ahead, that Jesus was 100% honest 100% of the time. That makes the Old Testament true. So what was written in the Old Testament? The words for sin. This was God-inspired. God told these people exactly what to write down, how to write it down, so on and so forth. So if God's dictating the Bible to these people who are actually writing this down, remember, these people were scribes. They wrote down whatever God told them to. And if God said, write this down, they did. So the words came from God himself. And the concept of sin came from God. That was his concept. not human concept. And thus concluding my argument. Those words were God's words. God invented them. He told these people to write them down. They did. And that's how we have them today. As a matter of fact, we have 6 nouns and 3 verbs that stand for sin. And if you don't believe me, all you have to do is look at the second link down below, and it'll tell you the 6 nouns and the 3 verbs, the 6 Hebrew nouns and the 3 Hebrew verbs that represent sin. These were all God concepts. They had nothing to do with humanity. All humanity did was wrote it down. And we're talking about the Jewish people. So, the only point you could even possibly argue on this was whether Jesus was 100% honest or not. As soon as we establish that, everything else falls into place. So, don't tell me that Jesus doesn't exist, because I have already proven that he exists. In 2 separate ways I have proven that he exists. So, the only question is, was Jesus 100% honest 100% of the time or not? And if he was, which I know he is, okay, he was and he still is, then that means he's the Son of God. God came up with these words. The Old Testament is true, and you're in deep trouble. I win. Alright, I will tell you more in a future video. Stay tuned.